Good morning and welcome to Harambee's Breaking Barriers webinar. I really am so grateful that you were able to take the time out of your very busy schedules to join us today. My name is Sanelisiwe and I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at Harambee, and I have the pleasure of hosting you this morning for what promises to be a really important conversation. Now, Breaking Barriers is a quarterly publication that analyzes the data from the quarterly labor force survey and the lived experience of over 5 million registered users on the SA Youth platform. What the publication does essentially is give us a holistic view of the trends in the labor market as they pertain to youth economic inclusion. The insights garnered from the Breaking Barriers are important precisely because evidence is so critical. At a time when data can feel so sobering, this really matters. By now, we've all seen the latest QLFS results, and so we all know that almost 300,000 jobs were lost in the last quarter. What Breaking Barriers really does is help us move beyond the headline numbers to better understand where barriers are deepening, where there are signs of movement and progress, and where practical action is required. It anchors our conversation and, importantly, our solutions in evidence so that we can hone in on what we must do, both as an ecosystem, but also as a country, right? As a nation, if we're really serious about providing young people with access to opportunities that they deserve and opportunities given the statistics at the scale that is required. And so to unpack the key insights emerging from the latest edition of Breaking Barriers, which is entitled Beyond the Storm, Transforming the Youth Employment Landscape Through Data and Bold Action, it is my pleasure and my honor to hand over to Victoria Duncan, who is the Head of Research at Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. Victoria, over to you.
Thank you, Zeng. Welcome, everyone. I'm so lovely to be here this morning. So it has been 50 years since the events of June 16, 1976, and since then, political freedom has been achieved, but economic inclusion is lagging, particularly for our young people. They face this dual challenge of enduring ongoing systemic barriers that are the legacy of the past, while also engaging in an unpredictable global context, shifting the economy as we know it. And this past quarter, we saw youth unemployment for those aged 18 to 34 reaching 54.6%. This is driven by seasonal dips, geopolitical events, and the absence of large-scale public employment programs. This is one of the highest rates that we've experienced if we exclude the COVID-19 pandemic years. And whilst this can be disheartening, much of the latest Breaking Barriers is focused on hope, as Zeng mentioned, and this hope that is felt by our young people and how this can be harnessed to engage them into the labor market. Like climate data, employment data is multi-layered, so it reflects short-term weather, seasonal cycles, and longer-term trends, and it's these latter structural shifts that we need to focus on to really shift the needle on unemployment. So what gives us confidence to say this? Firstly, the economic base is improving with growth persisting. Yes, it may not be at the levels that we'd like it to be, but it is on an upward trend. Secondly, national alignment is stronger than ever, with a growing collective consensus by business and government that youth employment is a national priority. And then finally, we have the infrastructure in the form of the SA Youth platform to support formerly unreachable young people into work. As Zeng mentioned, the platform has already reached over 5 million young people and has enabled over 2.3 million formal self-employment and public employment opportunities. So we have the infrastructure, we have alignment, and we have even early growth needed. The challenge now is to convert this into inclusive outcomes at scale for young people. And this leads us to our first insight within the Breaking Barriers. So growth creates jobs, but not automatically for young people. Sorry, can we switch to the next slide, please? Thanks. The growth that we are seeing in our economy is not translating into jobs for young people. Economic growth from the past 17 years has disproportionately created jobs for older workers, and we are seeing this decline in youth share of jobs. So young people are currently not benefiting at all from economic expansion. And there is this need to strengthen the correlation between growth and youth employment levels to avoid an entire generation of young people being left behind. But all hope is not lost. There are some sectors that are growing and can be powered by young people. And these are the ones we really need to focus on investing in. So retail is well positioned as an accessible entry point and has the capacity to absorb large quantities of youth. 40% of formal economy placements reported on SA Youth are in the retail sector. Global business services is another sector. There have been over 130,000 jobs that have been created and secured by young people since 2018 in the sector. 20% of these occurred last year in 2025 alone, and was the highest number recorded in any financial year. And finally, there's tourism, which is experiencing a significant boom. Direct jobs have grown by 28% between 2022 and 2024. And historical data has shown that youth have to date taken at least 40% of tourism opportunities. With intentionality, this proportion could grow to about half of all new jobs. So what do I mean by intentionality? This speaks to the need to shift hiring norms so that youth are not an afterthought, but are actually prioritized. And our evidence shows that that first job matters so much. So analysis from Harambee's income survey reflect that young people who land a structured, decent work experience are 10 percentage points more likely to remain in the labor market and 10 percentage points more likely to secure further wage employment. This showcases how the inclusion of mentorship and coaching, which is often found in structured entry-level employment, develops the work readiness skills needed for economic mobility. Intentionality also means that at an ecosystem level, we need to align tax credits, subsidies, and compliance instruments around inclusive hiring and skills investment. We need to remove red tape that inhibits growth, and we need to support an industrial private policy that is labor absorbing as well as service led. So growth needs to be designed to include youth. It cannot be assumed that it will trickle down and benefit them in time. So insight 2, one of the biggest learnings that we've had this past quarter is that despite youth being the most excluded demographic in our economy, they are more hopeful about their living circumstances and the state of the country compared to older adults, so those 35 years plus. This has both been confirmed by external research from Afrobarometer, as well as our own internal income survey. The question then is, how can this hopefulness be sustained and then mobilized into further action? So the SA Youth Contact Center does this by structuring conversations with young people and equipping them to identify obstacles and then taking one concrete action to begin to address this. The end result is that young people are not just reporting hope, but they're actually grounding it by consistently acting on it in small, repeated ways. These structured conversations are also supported by a new feature on the SA Youth platform, which allows young people to add up to 5 skills for each unpaid or self-employment experience that they record on their CV. This helps them to recognize both the value of all work, so unpaid work, self-employment work, hustle, as legitimate pathways into formal employment or into the formal labor market, as well as also provides signals to employers of transferable skills that they might have learned in other places that they can then bring into work. Finally, hope can be fueled by building bridges or providing bridges into paid work. And this points to the role of public employment programs, or what we like to refer to as PEPs. These interventions act as critical shock absorbers. And we saw this both during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we even see it in our most recent quarterly labor force survey results. So at the end of 2025, almost 200,000 young people were engaged in phase 5 of the Basic Education Employment Initiative. In quarter 1, there were 255,000 fewer young people employed. So the numbers from large-scale PEPs are reflected in national statistics, and the inclusion or absence of these interventions start to correlate with employment figures. So ultimately, with an insight two, we see that the issue is not actually motivation. It is whether the system recognizes and then provides the means to convert the hopefulness that young people face into actual tangible opportunities for economic engagement. And then finally, with insight three from our latest Breaking Barriers, we recognize that unemployment is unacceptably high, and a large increase in sustainable self-employment must form part of the solution. So unfortunately, engaging in self-employment is at the moment exceptionally difficult. And this is not due to young people not being motivated, as we saw with the previous insight, but rather actually points to an environment that inhibits the kind of measured risk-taking needed for entrepreneurship. So this risk aversion operates at three levels. Firstly, you've got a society-wide mindset and formality bias around self-employment, which ends up often resulting in these regulatory barriers which inhibits earning activity. Then you have the self-employment ecosystem itself, which is poorly set up to facilitate entrepreneurial value chains. And finally, at an individual level, you have the internalized risk aversion that many young people face themselves. So just as we experience this on three levels, we must begin to tackle this on three levels. So firstly, we really need to rethink our entrenched formality bias. There is this belief that the solution is always to formalize. And instead, the economy should rather be optimized to enable flow. So this speaks to linking income support to viable pathways into work, allowing activity in this messy middle to just emerge and grow, and importantly, making space for entrepreneurship. To bring about this shift, we need coordinated action across the ecosystem. And this is the second level. And this involves many distinct but interconnected actors, such as market intermediaries to connect and enable flow through the systems, financiers to provide capital and financing instruments, capacity builders to equip with skills, youth intermediaries to make self-employment aspirational, and motivators and guides for ongoing coaching and to build resilience. There are many organized that may take on multiple roles in the ecosystem. And within our Breaking Barriers, we mentioned two. We mentioned Umuzi and Riza Babuyile, which you can read a little bit more about. And these organizations work together or work across the ecosystem to provide the wraparound support needed to scaffold young people's self-employment activities. And finally, there's a need to shift the behaviors of young people. So this speaks to building the confidence to move them from the survivalist thinking to this smart and informed risk-taking required for entrepreneurship. Self-employment will only scale if we start to reduce this risk, if we improve the system, and we shift these mindsets simultaneously. So as we look ahead to this Youth Day, it does give us a moment to pause and reflect on the plight of our young people and what needs to be done to shift the long-term trend of unemployment. Thankfully, we do have a strong evidence of what works. So we need growth that includes youth by design. We need whole of society support for youth effort, and we need self-employment as a legitimate supported pathway. The task now is then to normalize and scale this across the ecosystem. You're welcome to read more in our latest Breaking Barriers. And Shani, I'm going to hand over to you to commence our panel.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And if you have a chance, please do read our Breaking Barriers report. The link is in the chat. It is my privilege and honor to welcome our panelists to deepen the discussion on the report and the insights that we have shared. I'm excited to welcome three incredible voices that are working incredibly hard to both shape and shift the narrative on youth employment in the country. Professor Haroon Bhorat, who is the director of the School of Economics at UCT. I've got Jantjies, who is the acting head of social policy at BUSA, a federation of business entities, and Ravi, the CEO and the chief executive officer of YES. I'm very excited to welcome our panelists, and they can share a little bit more about their work. And I'm going to take it in order of questioning. I'm going to start with Prof. Bhorat, not least because we had the last insight sort of share a little bit about what needs to shift in the South African economy for us to really address this challenge and actually reverse the tide rather than just stem the tide of youth unemployment. So I'm going to ask you, Prof. Bhorat, to start off with painting a little bit of a picture for us. You are an economist and have been studying the South African economy for well over a decade, 2 decades. And I'd love to give you maybe to start off to set the scene for us in terms of what is happening in the South Africa economy. How is it affecting young people in particular? Is it growth? Is it something else? What is the situation? Please explain for us and maybe paint a picture for us before we delve into the specifics of your questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shami. I mean, I think we can get into the details of it, but in many ways, if we just take a data point post 1994 and we look up until let's say 2023, 2024, this economy has created 7 million jobs, right? Which on the face of it, seems more than adequate, given that denominator. But over the same period between 1994 and 2023, 12.5 million individuals entered the labor force in search of employment. So an economy that's generating 7 million jobs seems optimal, but if the number of people looking for work and searching actively for work is 12.5 million, that gives you a growth in unemployment of 5.5 million. And I think many of the callers and the listeners on this webinar will know the data very well. What that translates into is an inability to generate, as we heard in the introduction, a sufficient number of jobs given the scale and the intensity of the growth in the labor force. What that does, though, is, and I think, Shami, before we get into the details, I think one needs to differentiate. One needs to have two conversations. I think the first conversation is about what is the ask in terms of wage employment. So what are we looking for in terms of scaling up, increasing the rate at which wage jobs are created in this economy, which is the very classic. How do we absorb those 5.5 million individuals that actually entered unemployment into the labor force? But the second conversation needs to be, and again alluded to in the introduction, how do we think not just about wage employment, but about work, but about economic activity? And that's really about self-employment and the informal economy. And for me, 95%, and I'm guilty as charged as well, 95% of our debate has been, until very recently, around the first question or the first topic, which is wage employment. We want to solve the unemployment crisis purely, and for young people in particular, purely in terms of a wage employment solution or formal sector solution. We're not thinking adequately and appropriately about that range of self-employment opportunities, which is not just, I must be very, very clear, it's not just about becoming a formal sector, high-skilled business in the tech industry. I mean, we need to think of the range of possibilities that exist in terms of economic activity to absorb these large numbers of unemployed.
Thanks, Prof. I'm going to double click on that a couple of, just in terms of a few points that you've raised. I think these are really important points to situate both wage employment and how we both increase absorption, especially of young people, as well as increasing creation of new jobs there. And Victoria and the research alluded to some of the bright spots there, and we can delve into that, especially when we talk to Sane and Ravi. But the second piece in terms of self-employment and work economic activity, as you call it. As you've said, it is something that we shy away from and have deep ideological debates on, etc. Is it too precarious? Is it not enough? I'm going to quote a number that that has stayed in my mind, certainly from your research, in terms of South Africa's GDP and the split of employment. You have said that in South Africa, comparable GDP, countries of our GDP, South Africa, for example, is skewed. So typically you would have 45% in the formal sector, 45% in the informal sector, and the rest unemployed. South Africa bucks that trend, and we have 50% in the formal sector, 16% in the informal sector, and the rest unemployed. And what this means, and this is particularly skewed for youth as well, what this means is more people are not working or not earning, and we have this formality bias. Maybe can you share a little bit more about that data point, especially as it compares with other countries as well? We'd like to hear a little bit more on that.
Sure. So the lead in for me is the wage employment discussion. We can have it. We should have it. It's a very familiar discussion, just because the topics are very germane to other developing countries, and we've dwelt on it a lot. What we haven't looked at is what I call the empirical smoking gun. So if you look at South Africa's unemployment rates across a range of emerging markets, middle income countries that are like ours, our unemployment rate, as we know, in the northern parts of the 30 percentiles, 30%, is the highest in that sample. If you take the same sample of emerging markets, that's the empirical smoking gun, and you look at informality rates, we at the lowest end of that sample. So we are a very unusual economy in the sense that we've got these very, very high unemployment rates, but at the same time, simultaneously, for the same sample of economies, very low informality rates. What do we mean by that? So most emerging markets close their labor market. That's the language we use. They resolve the unemployment problem partly through allowing large numbers of individuals unfettered access to the informal economy. You're allowed to go in and out of the informal economy and start a business and sell your wares wherever and whenever you want to. That's a very key distinction. And hence, the wage employment average that you quoted, the one that I've got in all these presentations I've done so many times, is the 45%. The average emerging market only has 45 out of 100 people in the labor force that are in wage employment. Only 45. We have 50. So how come they have such low unemployment rates? How come their unemployment rate's only 10? Well, they resolve the unemployment problem through allowing unfettered, through allowing easy access into the informal economy. We don't do that. We've got 50 people in wage employment. We don't have a wage employment relative problem. I'm not saying it's not an issue. We have the problem of large numbers of people that are in unemployment actually should be in the informal economy. That's that 16 to 34. Instead of 45 in the informal economy, you only have 16%, or even make it 20, if you want to quibble with the statistics here and there. We have far too few people in the informal economy, and hence this notion of talking about economic activity outside of the informal economy as that grease to the wheels of the unemployment problem. That I think, for me, the big sluice gates we can and should be thinking about opening for job creation is through allowing far wider, deeper access to the informal economy, and that's not presently the case.
Thanks, Prof. And I'm going to come back to those points. Last week at Harambee's offices, we had, young people come in and talk about some of their work in the informal economy and the structural barriers that they face. We had a young person, for example, doing street makeup, and she has to bear the risk, unfortunately, of a failing system where she has to, do her transactions, and unfortunately, she sometimes gets scammed. And the financial systems, for example, don't support a person like her who doesn't necessarily have registration and bank accounts to be able to trade, and yet she has a lot of potential and resilience. So there's something there, and Victoria talked about the hopefulness. I mean, there's a lot of young people that also demonstrate an interest and a passion for gig work and the informal economy. We're going to get back to those questions, Prof, maybe after we discuss some of the constraints regarding formal sector work as well. But thank you for painting that picture and setting the stage. I'm going to turn to you, Sane. Thank you for joining us today. You are acting head of policy at BUSA, and it is BUSA is a federated business association. Prof set the stage in terms of what's required, both of informal work as well as wage employment. Wage employment remains an issue, and we want to consider, importantly, the role of business in terms of understanding how business can both play a role in absorbing young people. And if you can maybe just articulate for us as a business association, what you think the biggest constraints are that are preventing business from hiring young people, and what we can actually address, and bright spots in terms of where business is actually doing a lot to hire young people, because that absolutely needs to be part of the table and the discussion in terms of increasing youth employment. So Sane, maybe paint a picture for us in terms of the work you do as acting head of social policy at BUSA.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Shami and the team for having me. As most of you know, just for some background, BOOST is the apex organized business body in South Africa, as Shami has already mentioned. And we primarily represent sector and industry associations engaging government, organized labor, social partners, and even civil society on economic reform. And we basically act as a structured interface between business and the state. And part of the work that we do as the Board of Social Policy and labor market mandate is skilling, but also more recently we've kind of woken up to the fact that even outside of the long game that is policy and looking at the kinks and the chunks within the PSET system and also within the wider issue of an economy that's not growing, we need to reckon with the issue of employment and mostly the unemployment of the youth of South Africa. So for BUSA, for the longest time, our main issue and our main stance, and actually what we were engaging on the public, was to say that obviously South Africa's youth unemployment challenge is not primarily a shortage of goodwill from business, but it's a challenge of scale, coordination, and economic growth. And I think that's a very widespread understood belief, and business across sectors increasingly recognized that creating pathways into earning for young people is both a social imperative and economic necessity. So basically what I'm trying to say is that in the past we've really just been looking at advocacy and policy when it comes to the technical inputs and things that need to change in our current post-school and education system. But what was very, very obvious when we formed the business government partnership is this issue that the employment and the creating of these pathways into earning for young people is both a social imperative but mostly an economic necessity. So what changed was sort of being able to elevate this issue to an apex level. And primarily, the messaging for us would be that youth employment is an economic issue for business because obviously skills pipelines and labor market access affect our competitiveness. And that's what's been coming out of the data. That's what's being repeated by members across our sectors and our corporates. Business is also acutely aware of the social instability and the risk that's actually associated with millions of disengaged young people that are sitting at home. So quickly then we started to organize around the fact that organized business has to become the modality for collaboration that across the various parts of business to surface these issues, identify these opportunities, and to also leverage sector champions that can shift the needle on this issue. Because on one hand, we're quite aware what the limitations are. We've spoken about the first constraint being low economic growth and businesses operating under conditions of very, very constrained demand. Infrastructure bottlenecks are huge, and they affect big business as well, in especially with respect to energy insecurity, logistics inefficiencies, and rising costs. So these are the issues that Business for South Africa looks at, and that we are tasked with looking at, because without a stronger growing economic growth, even the most committed of employers face these limitations. But what has been interesting is what has come out of the data that Harambee has produced to also speak about the fact that even in an environment where there is high economic growth, the stats are not guaranteed to change, and the shift in the mentality in terms of employing and creating these pathways wouldn't just be an automatic. So we had to reckon with the fact that we need to start thinking more creatively around these issues of youth employment and through the different streams. Interesting that Prof has mentioned youth self-employment, which is one of the streams that the Business Government Partnership is working on when it comes to the business initiatives as well as inclusive hiring. We often also speak about the significant mismatch, obviously, between labor market demand and the capabilities, experience and exposure of many young work seekers, and the plan. And I think what we're faced with on the table is to bridge that gap, because what we've often seen in these industries is that young people need a chance and an open door. And while employers often struggle to recruit candidates with these, workplace readiness, digital competencies, and practical experience that are are required for these entry-level roles. We need to balance the scales to make sure that we are working with partners on the ground, like Harambee, for instance, to make sure that we are working on this challenge that's compounded by the fact that many young people have never had access to these networks and information and opportunities that actually facilitate entry into the labor market. Obviously, one of the big ones, which is I think the third one, I'll close on this matter, but the employment ecosystem remains very fragmented for us, which is part and parcel a sort of direct, indirect link to this wider issue. We need a cohesion between governments. We need cohesion between training institutions, employers, intermediaries, and the community organizations that are doing the work on the ground to make sure that young people are accessing pathways to employment. Because with good intentions but without significant alignment, we won't get to the point where we can start to speak with a certain amount of candidness in terms of what is needed, and to also get organizations to demonstrate the fact that when employers, government, and labor market intermediaries collaborate and have these common objectives, these barriers can be significantly reduced. Thanks, Shami.
Thanks, Sene. I'm going to double click on two specific issues on the points that you raised. Firstly, the fact that you mentioned that youth unemployment is an economic issue, which I think is a really important thing to sort of double click on. You mentioned, for example, the data that we had shared regarding the relationship between GDP growth and youth employment. And even if GDP does grow beyond the 1.2% that's forecasted, young people are not likely to disproportionately benefit still. And we will have a large unemployed population, 9 million NEETs. For comparison, 9 million is the size of the country of Austria. So that's just one point. And I mean, just wanted to relate this to another issue. Some of you may have seen in the news, the UK last week released a report on 1 million NEETs in the UK. So this is unfortunately a structural issue, a macroeconomic issue in terms of growth and unemployment relating to youth that is coming soon to a theatre near everyone, not just South Africa. And we're experiencing perhaps the exacerbated effects of it because of our history of exclusion. So the economic issue of youth unemployment is vital. What you're alluding to with the BUSA, sort of championing this as an economic issue with sector leads and a focus for business to be practical, both in terms of increasing hiring of today, to absorb young people into jobs of today. And I want to ask you about quite specifically initiatives there, as well as unlocking barriers for creation of jobs of the future. I mean, rough statistic in terms of 50% wage employment. Arguably, business would say, we're doing a lot already. We're doing so much. I mean, Ravi will come in terms of the work that Yes is doing, but business is doing a lot. What more can be done? What ought to be done? And what are the sticking points in the conversations you've been having in terms of BUSA to encourage business to join this and to also address this issue, as you're saying, because it is an economic issue and has a sort of a vicious effect in terms of both investment confidence, but also the economy generally. But could you maybe talk a little bit about the initiatives that specifically are trying to unlock youth unemployment, address youth unemployment within the business community?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is a huge sticky issue because you're 100% correct, because the positioning of the private sector and their posture is that we are already doing quite a bit in very strenuous circumstances. And interesting, you mentioned the NEET issue just 2 seconds ago. Here at the ILO, we were speaking about NEETs. And just if you do a random Google search, South Africa is actually one of the countries that shows up quite quickly. So it's coming to a theatre near everybody, and it's already at South Africa's doorstep. But coming back to the initiatives, the existing relationship between business and I think Harambee and Yes and the PYEI meant that formalizing this business government partnership and creating a stream that looks at these pathways was an actual natural step. The advantage, of course, is the tripartism already exists. So obviously employment has already been a core concern for business and a clear strategy and shared problem statement, which I think is what we kind of didn't have formalized before, a shared problem statement that sort of built in confidence and the ability to engage collectively. So this partnership, which is not so new anymore, but this partnership was created to shift this framing. And I think that was the natural step where business said, okay, let's have a sit down. we are doing more. We do a lot already, but we definitely can do more by, we've long been focused on unlocking growth to create jobs, but this process is highlighting the structural nature of youth unemployment and the need for targeted interventions alongside the growth. And I think that is the defining difference. And obviously the convening role of organized business made it possible to bring stakeholders along and surface these opportunities already emerging within sectors, as well as scale subsector efforts that are already working. So, yes, for instance, as well, not necessarily a subsector effort, but a huge effort that's already been working in terms of not reinventing the wheel, but taking what's already been done and amplifying it. Another issue is that obviously this also allowed parts of business to play their strengths while BUSA focuses on policy with existing intermediaries and industry associations that are stepping in under its auspices to draw on, different things and different organizations to sort of bring collectively the mandate. So the defining factor, and I think what has really worked, there's been wins and there's been losses so far, but the collective shared problem statement and engaging collectively with our partners on the ground has really been a game changer.
Thank you, Sine. I'm going to come back to you in a second as well, after touching base with Ravi, but also wanted to reflect on what you said, and also just recognize the role of business and coming to the party. Victoria mentioned 3 sectors: retail, global business services, tourism. Those have been huge wins, both in the business community in terms of like driving forward the issue of a youth-powered economy, particularly in global business services and services generally. So we'll come back to that, and thank you for sharing. Ravi, I'm going to call you in, and you lead an organization that has made significant progress in partnering with the private sector. So I'd love to maybe hear you firstly describe the work of YES, and you've shown that business-led partnerships can create youth work experiences at scale, both in terms of absorbing young people into the economy and keeping them employed, and you have a really high successful retention rate. Maybe talk a little bit about the successes of that process and what you've learned in terms of helping employers see young people as part of the solution through your program.
All right, thanks for having me on, Shami. Great. So let me also start with a little bit of how we have had to think about structuring the program to do these things, based on perhaps picking up 1 or 2 points from the earlier panelists. So the first thing, let me just say, is we need much more economic growth than we already have. Okay, so from looking at the data, South Africa has been growing at about 1.1% per annum per capita as a GDP. Right, so that's very low because the population is growing at 1.3%. So that means technically we are minus 0.2% per year. So from 2009 to 2026, we have been growing at 1.1%. Population growing at 1.3%, that means we are actually underwater. So that is a very constraining environment when you are in economic decline. So other countries, take the OECD, is growing at 1.5% per capita, so that's positive. And you have other countries even further who are just growing faster. So the first thing is, yes, we are having positive growth, but not when we take into account population growth. Then we are per capita in the red. So that's the first thing. We got to get that number up, and I think that, and I'll come to how, therefore, that influences the way we're thinking about it at YES. And the second thing, picking up, and I totally agree, 100% with what Haroon is saying, is that a big absorber of people in jobs is supposed to be SMEs, micro entrepreneurs, small businesses. And in fact, I'm also on the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission said in 2012 that 90% of the new jobs would have to go into SMEs and in micro and small businesses. And we know that hasn't really happened because we have a very bad environment for SMEs. They pay the same taxes as large companies. They have the same labor laws as large companies. They have the same regulations as large companies. Everything, as if they're all a big bank. So we have a very repressed environment. And so I think those 2 things become very important. How do we boost economic growth? How do we get whatever economic growth we have to be as labor absorbing as possible? So from a YES point of view and how we've structured the program, we, as much as we can, we are strategically looking at how the opportunities and the pathways we create are pro-growth. So the people going into the companies, in a way, and we can talk about it later, are being, it's giving them a chance to help grow the economy. And the second thing we look at is how the people who come in through the program, because of what they learn, go on to become entrepreneurs. So as much as we can, we don't want to wait, of course, for the economy to grow and for small business, regulation to be changed, although that can happen much faster. What can we do now on the youth program? So I think that's really how we've been thinking about it. And that's why, so I can just say on the program itself, yes, has had, it's reached a certain level of scale. We've done 229,000 people in the program, 12 months full-time, 2,000 companies funding. So you won't find a bigger private sector funded youth employment program anywhere in the world. So it's got that level of scale. It's very dependent on the incentive which we have, which is a relatively weak incentive. But if you want a bigger number, you'd have to get a strong incentive. The incentive is that companies can claim what they do under the BE codes for 1 level or 2 levels. But the weakness is obviously if you don't need BE because you're in a sector that is not selling to government, it's not that important, or if you're already maxed out your BE levels and so on. So I think that's so it's got scale. But I think for us, what has been very important is the incentive. It does pull in a good number, and now we're looking at how to optimize that. And the second thing is we've had to structure it as an economic program, not a CSI program. So it means it is when you hire these young people, you're not doing anyone a favor so much as you're building the talent pipeline for your company. Practical example, let's look at the Vushini Group, TFG. So TFG does 1,500 people a year, and they use the incentive, but they really absorb 75% of those 1,500 every year at the end of the program permanently. So they become the admin staff, the IT staff, they run the branches. So the program is structured as a way to de-risk companies to take on more young people than otherwise would, but it must lead back to something that helps their business. And the third thing, which I think we're trying to build on is, you have a lot of ideas in this country. There are a lot of incentives all over the place, but the way the program is run must make sense for business. It must be administered in a way that business can work with it. So over the last 6 years that YES has had this incentive, we've got companies who've been repeat customers 4 years, 5 years, because they come back, because the program is gaining a track record. They can see how they can structure it. It makes economic sense for them. So I think those are the key things we've had to build in over the year, and it's over the years. And I think it's making a contribution, as Sania said, and we think now it's kind of post-pilot. Pilot has worked. It's really scaled up 30% a year over the last 5 years. And now, where do we take it? That's really where we are now.
Thanks, Ravi. I think that's really, really valuable. I want to maybe ask a couple of questions related to some of the questions I asked Sane a little bit, which is, the employers are doing a lot, and we know that we still aren't making a dent in youth unemployment, and we're sort of at the point where we are asking employers, government, social sector to do more. How has the conversation been for you with employers, and what do you think needs to shift for us to actually make a dent, to move from sort of proof points? I mean, your numbers are very impressive, 229,000, even the Vushini Group example you gave with the 75 absorption rate, etc. What needs to shift, and how can we move from incrementalism to something that actually makes a dent in this problem? Maybe can you share a little bit about that? Are we at a window and a moment where that is possible?
I think we are as a country, very much in a crisis point, right? Because if you think about it, we are also competing with cheap, good quality imports, and we are seeing the waves, the first waves of the AI tsunami reaching our shores. So we can't. So if we thought we had problems before, the problems are only exacerbated now going into the future. So anyone looking at this point can say, well, there are difficulties, but there are also more coming. So I think the way the conversation, so we don't think of CSI programs. So yes, it's not a CSI program. We run away whenever we hear that term because it's like, please no, there is no scale potential for CSI. We look at, the conversation is, you do this transformation, you support these talent pipelines, you are building the economic capabilities of the country. That is how things are sustainable. Transformation equals more economic capabilities. T equals EC. That formula then has to be at the height of it. So the conversation is, let's get as many talented people as possible to get this know-how of how companies operate, to get the experience within companies. They will be the ones, so if they're working in the renewable sector, they will help us make SARUM, our master plan for renewables, work. And we can be successful as an exporter in renewables. Or they learn how it works, they can go set up their own renewables companies. But we need that talent to grow the sector. So that becomes very important. How do you make these programs work economically? Now, of course, you can understand that, but remember, every company in the world and every country in the world is working on a commercial competitive basis. So then how do we make the rules easier to do that? So the conversation is, how do we make the rules easier to do that? And many people would be interested to know that government actually has rules that stop companies supporting youth under YES. You have to qualify. So to get into the YES program, you first have to do all the other BE things in the code. You have to do your equity transactions. You have to do your skills development certifications, this. Otherwise, you can't be allowed to support youth employment through YES. And we said, isn't that the craziest thing? Shami just told us it's our biggest crisis. So why is it not? So why do you have to qualify to support, to be part of the YES program? Shouldn't you just say everybody who wants to support youth and, in a verified program should be able to support them in the program? That would 10x the YES number. That would take. So we'd say change the rules that restrict youth employment being a priority. Make it a priority if, like you say, it is. Then number two, let's also look at how we can increase the strength of the incentives. So one of the questions again is, well, we have so much money that we're trying to spend on skills, but our skills money is going to pay for certificates. And shouldn't we rather say the 500 billion that goes to education and training, and 150 billion of that goes to post-school, shouldn't you make that their KPI be employability? Doesn't matter who gets the money, but the point is, if you're only producing for certificates, then a lot of that money is just a certificate factory. So let's say if your certificates don't lead to jobs, you should be defunded, and the funding should go to someone whose certificates are leading to jobs, have a better connection. So the conversation is, let's use the resources we have better. Let's try to pipeline to build the sectors that are important for us, because that's where the jobs are going to come from. And we'll have to look at, how do we ensure we are supporting a much bigger layer of smaller businesses so that people are getting this experience? How do they work as suppliers to all the companies, including the YES program? And we'd have to look at things as well about how do we regulate for the problems coming in? Because I can tell you, even though we say AI is going to cause many jobs as much as it creates, no, it's not. No, it's not. The person who loses their job as a cashier is not going to become an AI ethics officer. So we would have to think about how, just the same way we protected petrol attendants, and you don't find petrol attendants in the UK when you go to fill your tank. Here we have 45,000 petrol attendant jobs. We regulated for that. So we would have to think about all of that as business and the government. But I think a big part of it is we have a lot. What we find is that people in this country are very talented. I mean, they're very resilient to the extent possible. And we just have to unlock that and see that as a business opportunity, but in a very strategic way connected to sectors and so on. So I think Africa is well placed. Even in AI, we're one of the top 20 AI producing countries in the world. So we need to really mobilize our efforts jointly, government and business, and focus on those opportunities, and also just mitigate the risk. And you have programs. So you've got Harambee, you've got you've got a whole lot of things. How do we build on the things that are working? Because we don't have time to spend another 6 years creating something from scratch. How do we scale up and target those things? So I think a lot of the conversation is, we have kind of run the clock down, and we need to move forward. But like I said, transformation must equal more economic capability in the end.
Thanks, Ravi. I'm going to try and remember that T is equal to EC, my new sort of equation for the day. I want to recap the first round of questions with a few points. Firstly, thanks, Ravi, you made this point quite clear. Hiring young people is not CSI. It can power forward sectors, industries, the economy as a whole. But I also wanted to maybe recap a few other points that all of the speakers made. And these are, I think, important because it's a complex issue. There's no silver bullets. There's no single solution. But we have proof points and possibly a flywheel in motion at this point. But one of the things that was mentioned is growth. Unequivocally, across all three speakers, you said growth is critical, but it is not enough. And we need to address growth with specific targeted interventions. Prof alluded to the fact that wage employment needs to both increase and be made easier. Ravi, you also alluded to that in terms of getting more young people easily into the YES program. Wage employment is critical, and we need to unlock new jobs. And I also talked about new job creation and the importance of sector champions there. But wage employment is still not enough. The third point that I'd like to make is that Prof mentioned that self-employment is vital. We have a formality bias, and I think some of the other speakers referred to it. But understanding unlocks in the self-employment space and making it less risky is vital. Both Ravi, you and Sane mentioned the fact that business is doing a lot. There's an opportunity to do more, both with de-risking what business is doing by hiring more young people and making it easier, but also by coordinating efforts and trying to build on this coalition. And similarly, government ought to be doing more as well by spending more wisely. I think, Ravi, you alluded to that and to them as a skilling. President, for example, alluded to this in the State of the Nation address in February, calling for a skilling revolution. How do we future-proof our skilling systems by spending wisely on outcomes and employment outcomes in particular? But Ravi, I'm going to pick up on this last point as a segue to a question to Prof. Two questions, and maybe I'll ask you both questions in one. Prof, you've outlined the relationship between growth and employment, but particularly also about graduate employment, and that links to Ravi's point around skilling. And you've talked quite explicitly about the need for us to look at why did graduate unemployment rise, for example, these past few years? I mean, that's shocking in the sense, a lot of young people with requisite degrees, etc., still not finding work, as well as employment figures for those without the higher ed qualification still pretty high. That seems to be quite at odds with the fact that, Ravi outlined the need for future-proofed skills, etc. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? And then I'll ask my second question regarding sectors that could be promising for our growth and employment. So, Prof, over to you.
Sure, Shami. I mean, I think so. Let's just so generally we focus on the national unemployment rate or national youth unemployment rate, and that's correct. We tend to just keep an eye, or at least I have from time to time just kept an eye on the sort of within national distribution. So you look at, of course, race and gender and age. Those tend to be fairly similar. But at least what I picked up in the latest data, if I could just give you the actual numbers, is so the period 2014 to 2024, I've separated out TVET, so technical colleges unemployment rates from higher education, which would be sort of university unemployment rates, and the increases have been stark. So, for example, the TVET unemployment rate has gone up from 14% to 22%, 21.5%, right? Even the starting point of 14% is really high, but to then go up that dramatically is surprising. And then higher education, which is university unemployment rates, have close to doubled. So they've gone from 6% to 10%. So, and so when you unpack this, what you tend to find is that when you look at the rates of change, so in other words, even though the absolute level of graduate unemployment rates and graduate unemployment numbers, the absolute numbers are fairly low, the rates of change are very, very high. So in fact, what you've seen, the highest rate of change, the highest increase in unemployment rates by education level has been for TVET and higher education graduates. So what does it point to your question, Shami, is that there's two issues here. The first is what Ravi has raised, which is a low growth environment, an environment that's not conducive either in terms of levels or structure. So you have a growth rate that's barely squeaking in at 1.5%. It's just too low in terms of orders of magnitude. But even within that, the structure of that growth. So if it's not labor intensive enough, or if it's not job generating enough and it's highly capital intensive, think of it, if every job in the economy was created in the mining industry, we'd have very few jobs, right? So you need a particular structure of growth to generate the jobs you want. So that's the first issue. The second is the skills mismatch. So the problem you have, so it's easy to understand if you have a skills biased employment trajectory that those individuals only have a matric or incomplete secondary are not finding employment. And then you look at the great work that Harambee and Yes and others do, which is the top up and skills and so on. But you have a problem if those individuals are getting through the entire schooling system, going on to higher education, and then they still can't find jobs. And that's a mismatch problem. It means that these individuals are, in the language we use, is accumulating human capital of the wrong type. So, and you do tend to find that in the data that across a lot of the curricula that's been adopted or accumulated by individuals, and they tend to be, for example, in education, so education type degrees, humanities degrees, in health, right? These individuals are accumulating human capital in the areas that are not in demand by employers or in areas that are not growing fast enough. And so we may have and there's a separate debate, but we may have a human resource system or an educational system that is generating and not responding to signals in the economy. So generating far too many individuals, say in health and education, relative to what the system can demand. But I think you just want to put a peg in it. Again, just to be clear, the absolute numbers are small, but it's worrying if you've invested so much of your fiscal space into getting individuals through to sort of 15, 16 years of education, and you're seeing effectively a doubling in the number of these individuals at the higher education level that cannot find employment.
Thanks, Prof. I mean, I was looking at the report from the UK as well last week regarding the 1 million needs there. And that is exactly the same sort of issue in terms of graduates with several degrees. And I think, there's a lot of structural factors also at play in terms of the types of jobs that are currently available, as well as the skilling that's required. And I think Ravi's point regarding the skilling reforms are really vital in thinking about outcomes-led skilling. I think maybe one last question before, rounding out the questions to the other panelists and taking some questions from the chat. You've written extensively about industries without smokestacks, sectors that could absorb young people and generally be job absorbing or job generative of the future. Can you touch on that? I mean, you had a very catchy title for that paper that you outlined, I think, a few years ago, Industries Without Smokestacks, or IWAS. Can we bet on some of those sectors and industries for generating jobs of the future? What do they look like? What do they have in common? Can you share a little bit of that research for sort of bright spots in terms of where we could unlock jobs?
Yeah, so a lot of that, again, we don't have the time to go into detail, so I encourage people to go and have a look at the research, is built off a sort of a global phenomena in the developing world that's been observed. Danny Roderick at Harvard calls it premature deindustrialization. So the idea in the past is that you generate large numbers of low-wage jobs through manufacturing exports, in essence, right? And Japan did it, Taiwan did it, South Korea did it, and China is doing it at the moment. Vietnam is at the frontier as well, and same with Bangladesh. So you build this large, low-wage employment base through manufacturing exports, and that's your industrialization strategy. What's happened, though, is that there's countries in Latin America and South Africa included, who are going through this contraction, this premature contraction, premature deindustrialization of manufacturing. And so that has led, and there are all sorts of reasons for that, and it's very difficult for us to compete, say, in cheap manufacturing goods with China, with Vietnam, and so on. And so that has led to the idea that perhaps we need to be looking at services, the kind of sectors that Harambee and Yes and others are looking at, where effectively semi-skilled services industries that are partly exportable, they're not all non-tradables, can become a platform for employment generation. So that's everything from, I would argue, survivalist enterprises in retail for entry-level jobs in the informal economy, where I think there are massive issues to resolve there, right through to sort of high-tech credit card recon businesses in the services, in business services, banking, financial and insurance, and so on, telecoms. So the services industry, health services, educational services in the private sector can become an engine for employment generation, to sit next to, if you like, almost a fixing or a reordering or of the manufacturing industry. I want to be very clear that I think there's still a space for niche manufacturing exports. We just need to protect what we have and use that as a platform, I think, for picking out niche, high-end products where we have a comparative advantage and it's not pure cost-based, which is sort of what Germany's done to try and compete with China. And I think there are possibilities for sort of manufacturing excellence for South Africa to look at. But the rump of the job generation, I think, is going to come from the services sector.
Thanks, Prof. That's certainly what we're seeing. For example, in SA Youth, the bulk of our placements, for example, comes from services, including retail, hospitality, GBS, and the like. Sane, I'm going to ask you a question before rounding out the final question to all panelists. But I mean, we talked a little bit about business contribution and their commitment to this coordinated response. We're possibly seeing a window of opportunity where this coalition, joint coalition, and the Federation of Business Entities that you help drive and lead is poised to make an outsized commitment to this. But what is it going to take? What is meaningful private sector leadership now in terms of hiring young people and sustaining their entry and in retention into the labor market look like? Not just in terms of commitments, but also in terms of implementation discipline, accountability, and willingness to partner across the ecosystem.
Thanks. So we've really just identified three simplistic sort of schools of mini thought. The first being ongoing clarity and collaboration from government on strategic direction, both in policy, environment, and program implementation is going to be essential, because if these two do not marry each other, we won't find each other, firstly. The second one, which is also quite important, is that business is going to need to prioritize internal change management. And I think it's the biggest one, because it's not quite easy to sort of roll the carpet out and instruct, for this kind of thing to happen. So it does need intense lobbying and intense mobilization, because internal change management is sort of a top-down sort of approach with stronger sector level pathways that prioritize inclusive youth hiring and integration into whatever it is. It could be workforce planning, so that participation becomes a very normal part of operations rather than CSI or special initiative. So this is by far the biggest one that's going to take an all-sector approach, is what we would say. Then the third would be measurable outcomes. So it's not quite popular to set out numbers, because I think at this environment, chasing a set bag of numbers that we're not quite sure how to attain, whether it's short or medium or long term, is a little bit dangerous. But we do need some very concrete outcomes and clearly defined roles in the next phase that's going to matter. We're currently in the phase, so it wouldn't be the next phase, because the partnership is going to launch its next phase in June. happen. So business needs to respond with certainty and clarity. And for that to happen, we need clearly defined roles between the stakeholders, as well as measurable outcomes and goals, which I think we have been and we are currently finalizing from a co-creation point of view. So those three are what we've stuck with, and what will be trying to attain in the next couple of months and even years, I'd say. Thank you, Shami.
Thank you, Sine, and wishing you very good luck in sort of the relaunch of that partnership and commitment. Those sound really exciting to help drive forward a coordinated response. Ravi, over to you. You talked about talent pipelines in the first set of conversations. And you also mentioned skilling and the future of skilling to future-proof our workforce. But maybe talk a little bit about how you've been evolving your programs, both to meet the need and to support talent pipelines within business, but also to have a more employment challenge, and also how you're thinking about skilling for the future.
Right. So how we've tried to structure the programs is so we have some flexibility to sit with companies and say, because we don't want it to be it's not a placement program as such. It's a pipeline. So how do we structure that? So we have brought, so we are targeting as much as possible, supporting what we consider to be the growth sectors. So when a company supports YES, they have a choice. The choice is, like a Vashini, they'll say, look, we sponsoring people and we already know what we're going to do. We sit with them and they have a 5-year plan. And it's like, okay, so these are the kind of people they want to bring in with ideally these attributes, because they see them becoming branch managers or IT people or whatever it is. So that's always good. That's 75% of the number we get typically is like that. And 25% of the numbers we have, Shami, I don't know if you know it, but YES is actually a DFI. We're actually a development finance institution of a sort, because companies, let's take a mining house. If a mining house joins YES, they're not putting the young workers down the mine. Firstly, South Africa is not doing any mining, which is sad. But when they do support mining, when the mining company does support us, they want to put them to help the community, and they will take credit for that in their social labor plan. That's wonderful, because now we're okay. In Mpumalanga, we really want to support the green energy sector. So let's now take these young people and put them to solar PV installation or some assembly. So we end up spending time looking at how to build these sectors with the 25% that we have, which last year was over 10,000 people. So that was 800 million rand that YES was programming to sectors. And we've said to government and partners, tell us, please, if you had 10,000 people coming from TVET universities or no academic qualification, but just very smart, what could you do with them? So we would say, so part of it is, we love green hydrogen. It's such an important sector. We have so many PowerPoints about it in the country, but there's 100 jobs. So like, okay, well, we can't really fill 10,000 people there. So what do we need to do? So a lot of our time is now spent also curating how to do, where people could go. So that's one area that is very important. Then we've taken a second point, which is, like I say, AI is here. Our view is people plus AI tool is better than AI on its own. And companies that just sort of replace people with AI, AI is the biggest liar and cheater you could possibly have, as we've seen. So a lot of things can't be AI on its own. But it's very important that everyone has a level of digital or AI tool competence and confidence, because that's the way you are protecting yourself. You are that person who can use the tool. So we make sure, in terms of the skilling, the future-facing side of it, and how to help future-proof people as much as possible, is they must have certain certifications or competencies, even if it's not certified. Definitely not CETA accredited or QCT accredited necessarily, but it can be accredited by the companies. So we're rolling a lot of training for people as standard in the YES program on how to use AI tools, digital skills. Doesn't matter if you're doing logistics or last mile delivery driver, or you are in a car company, or you're in IT. So I think that's really how we're doing it. And then Third is because the program has now got quite a critical mass of companies, got tech companies, car companies, delivery companies, all of them. It's how we can curate the companies together, which is really important, because a Microsoft or a company producing technology wants people to learn the stuff that they are generating, which is good if we think it's a good cigarette to smoke. It's a good product that you've got, and you want people to be comfortable with your product. We're very happy to say, okay, why didn't we train all the people in our car companies with your system, but you pay for it? And by the way, even though this is a car company, we know there's an EV sector development program coming, and then these people could end up as options there. So it's really putting it together, but a pathway of institutions where the sum is greater than the parts individually being put together. So I think that's essentially how we're trying to do it, and of course it's so then that becomes a basis to say, okay, now if we had a better connection to the vaster sums of money that's going into skilling, it could connect and accelerate in that way. So when we looked at, for example, Haroon was talking about TVET colleges, and they get, I think it's 15 billion rand a year. And we looked at the data and we saw that only 28% of the TVET content is technical. The people doing TVETs, only 28% are doing technical stuff. And we think technical is very important, and the non-technical is very hard to find jobs with. So we'll be like, okay, but if you started to reprogram your curriculum and your spending, it could be much more valuable to where we think the economy ought to go. So we can line up other resources in a way that makes sense. So I think that's essentially how we're doing it, is trying to think about how the collaborations and the partnerships can leverage what we already have in a way that's impactful.
Thanks, Ravi. No, I think that's really great. I love your equations. People plus AI is greater than just individual alone. I'm going to take away quite a few equations from you. I have some questions from the audience that I'd like for us to address. I'm going to be very directive about where they go because we're running out of time. So there's a few questions, for example, on the informal sector, some on SME and SME development and the reliance on the formal sector as well. But I'm going to point some specific questions to each of you. One, a question for Prof. Bhorat. Is the problem with the informal economy that it's equivalent to survivalist income, so it doesn't generate enough income to sustain livelihoods because it is generally low skilled, is the exception of the tax industries. There are other high barriers to entry there. And a related question, and this is from Ntubela, about skilling for self-employment and entrepreneurship skills development. So that's a question for Prof. Question I'm going to ask you, Sane, to answer is, there's a symbiotic relationship between big business and SMEs. You need big business in order to have a flourishing SME sector. What is, for example, BUSA doing to help develop that? And then related to that is a question on government-supported programs for international business to come in to South Africa. Are we making it easy enough for global employers to enter, operate, and hire in South Africa? I know that there's great examples from the GBS program and the incentive there. And a question I think you can answer, Ravi, on skilling as well. Young people and graduates end up entering workforce through roles that are below their qualification, leading to underemployment. Is there a labor market issue or a skills mismatch issue? How do we prevent this from becoming a pandemic? But feel free to answer questions that I haven't directed at you as well. But maybe, Prof, if you can answer the informality question, then Sane, I'll ask you to answer the question regarding SMEs, and then to you, Ravi.
Great. Thanks, Shami. I mean, we are very similar to other developing countries in terms of the range of informality that exists, right? So you'll find just the scale is too low, but you'll find every individual. So the formal definition is if the individual or the collection of individuals that constitute a firm, right, is not registered, not paying tax, doesn't have a license, in general will be regarded with 2 or 3 of those categories will be regarded as informal. And it ranges from everyone who is literally selling food by the side of the road in a local township area because they're prevented from doing so in cities most of the time, right through to a formal spaza shop in a township. And it generally tends to be in a township because cities force regulation on informal enterprises. But that spaza shop is actually sourcing inputs and supplies from formal retailers, right? So they're selling the products that we all know and buy. And that often is a spaza shop that is fairly small, but does a fairly good turnover. And it's been there for 10, 15 years. Many of us know of these enterprises, right? They sort of, we grew up around them. And I think that's the important thing, is that when we start seeing this range of enterprises from the true survivalists right through to something that is a little bit more established and has been around for many, many years and is, it's not a wage job, but it's a very secure, ongoing form of economic activity. We need to find ways to encourage that activity. And it includes not just on the retail side, but production. If you think of home-based mechanics and so on. Then just very quickly in terms of, I think the question was around skills. I think Ravi and Sanelisiwe alluded to it. The challenge is not accumulation of human capital. It's not the getting more degrees. It's the type of degree, right? And so very bluntly put, you may end up with a 3-year degree in humanities at the best university in the country, but that's actually probably less useful and less likely to lead to secure employment relative to, say, going to a TVET college and picking up a few coding courses, for example. And I think it's that skills gap that seems to be growing, or at least we have a fiscal transfer system, bursary programs, funding of higher education that's not adequately aligned to these skills needs.
Thanks, Prof. Sine, I'm going to ask you to answer the SME and investor business role in attracting investors question.
Absolutely. So I think I'll just start with the SME question. So and thanks, I do like that question. So when it comes to SME and youth access, one of the recommendations that we have identified under our pillar on intelligence, apprenticeships and access, when it comes to the skills revolution work that must be done, since the presidential announcement, it's so nice that we're pushing for SME voucher mechanisms for simplified grant access through employee associations, which is currently something that is isolating SMEs from accessing a huge part of PSET and also enabling them to participate within, the larger PSET system. Also dedicated NSF funding windows for informal sector initiatives and scaling some of the services seated digital sourcing that already exists with work readiness and placement modalities. So we're targeting upwards of 10,000 structured youth work opportunities per priority sector per year. But obviously these are just grand plans that we are introducing to the arena of the skills debate that's about to ensue after the restructuring of DHET's priorities, as well as what needs to happen to ensure that the PSET system turns on its head and starts to make headway into a PSET system that's agile. Then when it comes to the business partnership, and I want to talk specifically on the self-employment and public employment issue, on the youth earning through self-employment that I already spoke about, and the enterprise and prep. So there's several things, like reducing barriers to informal trade, to produce self-employment, and we're engaging DSBD, the presidency, as well. And the goal there is to reduce these regulatory barriers to informal trade and enable the ease of issues like business licensing. So several things have happened there, including introducing or trying to introduce centralized digital platforms and things of that nature. Then obviously the big one, the big ticket item, what that comes up whenever we speak SMEs is financing for SMEs, agreeing on implementation and agreed processes to amend several things and unlock bank finance for SMEs to sustain growth and labor absorption. And that partnership partnership is between DTIC and BASA. We've also got the stream on financing and supporting the youth self-employment, and we're hoping to conduct through this partnership a landscape review of existing business and government youth micro and SME funding, and enterprise support initiatives to understand how opportunities are available to also scale private sector efforts. So these engagements are between trade and industry, or DSBD, as well as obviously with the correct players within the business community. So again, grand plans, co-creating a plan between these government counterparts as well as business counterparts, and hopefully they will be finalized quite soon and launched. But at the heart of this particular stream wants to put SMEs at the center, because I think it's quite obvious that we identified gaps in terms of how we do this. So the third question, I think you said, was on the investment, and I mean, currently, and it's one of the challenges we do face that Shami had pointed out in terms of the private sector, is currently running its business under very constrained efforts, and the posturing almost always is we're doing quite a lot. And to be quite honest, the private sector is doing a lot, because currently, sustaining foreign investment by heavily co-funding infrastructure projects, incubating, mentoring enterprises for supply chains, and also driving innovations in some of these high growth sectors that we've mentioned, like for instance, renewable energy, which is one of the big ones, and key strategies are looking at investment mobilization and that sort of thing, and also de-risking foreign entry, because we need to try and provide this local knowledge and capital and operational partnerships to international firms. So that's already happening. But again, what are we doing in the future facing sort of tapestry of the labor market? And that's part and parcel of what the B4SA structure is now looking at in terms of what has already been done and what we're currently doing. What can we do in the future to add on to the fact that we've got all of these accelerator programs, these road shows and South African investment conferences. We need to now go into the specific industries, and also if we're looking at the current climate, the geopolitics as well as the governance issues, what is it that we need to co-create and look outside of what's already been done, and come to an agreement. So I hope I've answered the second question.
Thanks.
Well.
Thanks, Sane. I think you have. I'm going to unfortunately ask Ravi to conclude us. I'm going to ask Ravi to start, and then the other two panelists both to answer some of the questions, but also what is one concrete shift that South Africa needs to make, either the policy or the implementation side, and what you would commit to, and also what gives you hope at this moment? Because we've talked a lot of complex issues and many plans, but something concrete that needs to shift and something that gives you hope. Ravi, Prof, and then Sane.
Okay, good. So what I think we need to shift straight away is we need to do some reforms in terms of SMEs. So we need to be able to make it easier for people to actually run an SME. We need to change the tax rates for SMEs. We need to change the total burden of rules for them, and actually help them to grow, because that's where a lot of the jobs are going to be. I'm absolutely not a supporter of informal economy, because that means unregulated. I think they should be lightly regulated, because I would not want to see a spaza shop selling poisoned food to school children. What we mean is they're regulated, but they don't pay the same tax. They don't do the same. It's just easy to go. So I think that's one of the big things we need to do. Obviously, the other thing where we're sitting with a huge amount, the biggest expenditure in government is on skills and education, and that needs to be changing its KPIs. Just change the KPIs, employability. And then the third, and which gives me hope, is South Africa has got a lot of case studies, and obviously I'm punting yes, but I think there's a lot of other things where we actually doing things which are leading in the world, and let's connect all these pieces together. And in fact, we can show the rest of the world how to deal with the incoming tsunami of AI, and how to take advantage of key sectors. We are both a developing country and with aspects which are advanced economy. That's the bad
Thanks,
thing,
Ravi.
because that's why we block out SMEs, because we are a country of large companies and large unions, but also it means we produce a lot of things. So I think we sit at the cusp where the problems we're solving for are also the problems globally that if they're not solving for now, they will be in 5 years' time.
Thanks, Ravi. So we can turn our crises into solving for global crises eventually. Prof, over to you, 30 seconds, please, and then Sunny as well.
Yeah. I mean, so, there's a whole range of activities going on in the formal economy and around wage employment and so on. I think there's been a massive underemphasis on the informal sector. And I think, Ravi's point is important. This is about a scaffolding of regulation. So you don't want sort of poisonous food out there and so on. So there are ways in which you do the absolute minimum, but you do not criminalize informal activity. At the moment, the idea that you criminalize informal activity in cities where people are, where rich consumers are, is deeply problematic. So there's a whole range of regulations, of supply side policies that we can encourage to entice, to give more breathing room and more oxygen for survivalist enterprises and the informal economy through that range of small enterprises, from the survivalists right through to the established spaza shop or backdoor mechanic. I think that's the oxygen this economy needs. We haven't done nearly enough. And in fact, it's almost, Shami, my final point is, it's not, we actually at a stage before that, there is a policy blockage in terms of thinking about this part of the economy as an opportunity for employment generation. At the moment, it's viewed as a nuisance sector that you have to regulate, that you have to formalize. We have the wrong, almost philosophical approach to employment generation for this part of the economy.
Thanks, Prof. Sane, 10 seconds and we have to close.
Thank you. And I think the speaker stole my thunder, but I want to align myself to Ravi and Prof, and especially what Prof has said about the informal economy. The stats for employment equity are showing us that the private sector isn't employing the amount of people that most people who view the labor market statistics is. So unless we are looking at that particular sector with fresh eyes, but also with the intention to actually revitalize it, we're actually going nowhere. So now that acknowledgement has been made, we're really hoping for some movement. And then the second part for me, which is rather a really niche one, but when it comes to the skills system, which is largely related to this, global comparators have shown us that better is possible. International evidence demonstrates that a very well-designed system delivers measurably better outcomes. So South Africa doesn't actually need to invent these new models. It just needs to adapt the proven ones. So those are my two last points. Thanks, Ravi. So Shami.
Thanks very much, panelists. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for sharing your insights. I think ranging from the policy, the regulations, the importance of economic growth, the fact that we can't pin everything on wage employment alone, although we need to de-risk it and make it more available to young people, the importance of self-employment, SMEs, scaling for the future, and very importantly, that growth is very much a requirement and that we need all of these solutions at the table. What gives me hope is that we have panelists and partners like yourselves, Ravi, Sane, Prof. Haroon. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your insights, and your continued partnership to addressing this critical crisis. There is a window of hope that we can actually make a dent in this crisis, and we really thank you for your valuable continued partnership. Thank you very much. And for further information, you can always look at our reports and tune back into a recording of these in the future. And I'm going to hand back to the program director, Sanelisiwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charmy. And I think that was a great wrap up. And I'm glad that we're leaving on hope, because I think that as much as there is so much going on right now, there are bright minds like our panelists that have joined us. There are organizations that are working so hard to look for solutions to this problem, partnering together. And I think importantly, what we are really seeing now is that hope comes in many, many forms. There is more that needs to be done, but there is a national plan that is coordinated. And we're really seeing business, civil society, as well as government rallying around this plan and coming together to start to make a dent in this crisis. And therefore, I thank you all for joining us here today. Everybody who has joined us will get a copy of the Breaking Barriers, the latest Breaking Barriers edition, and we will also be sending the links that several of you have asked for to the Prof's latest research. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you at our next webinar in 6 months' time. Thank you so much, and farewell.